Hello, I'm Jim Morningstar. I'm being interviewed today by Tom Pilarzyk, who is the author of Yoga Beyond Fitness and yoga articles in the US, Canada, and the UK. The interview today is on the evolution of breathwork. Tom is going to be asking me questions about my personal participation in the evolution of contemporary breathwork and the field in general, as it's led from the medical practices all the way to the spiritual domain of breathwork. Glad to be with you today, Tom.
Thank you, Jim. Me too. Jim, you have a 40-year career in working with the breath.
Mm-hmm.
And no doubt it has evolved in certain ways. And I'm wondering if you can give me some sense of the direction that you see breathwork having evolved.
Okay. Well, for me personally, I started focusing on breath way back in doing athletics in high school and college and so on. But then as I got into the field of psychotherapy, I noticed that something was missing just in dialoguing with people. It felt like there was an aspect of vitality and aliveness that was being channeled just into the mental. It was then that I discovered the work of Alexander Lowen, bioenergetics, and other practices like Gestalt that reinvigorated me. In fact, I was despairing at one point of thinking that I would even continue in the practice of psychotherapy until I found ways that I could do it that incorporated the body, movement, and breath. Alexander Lowen was probably the greatest teacher in that regard, in that he was a psychiatrist whose wife was a physical therapist. And so he was influenced very much about how behavior can be changed when you incorporate the body and physical movement, and that necessitated open and free breathing. So I started out learning about the breath stool, leaning backwards over a stool to open the chest and invigorate the cells of the body, which made a vast difference in how I thought and how resourceful I was. Then along came a technique called rebirthing and rebirthing breathwork, which I was immediately attracted to because it focused almost entirely on the effects of opening the breath to free one's physical, mental, and spiritual capacities. So that began in the 70s, mid-70s, and continued to this day. I was, at that time, somewhat of a wisecracker. I thought, oh, yes, I've learned this new thing, and I'll be on to learning all sorts of other new things next month. I've never found the complete heights and depths of what breathwork can teach. And I'm a continual student of the spirit of breath, as it were, to this day.
How has the field changed over that period of time? What have you seen grow? What have you seen diminish?
Well, in terms of professional work, Alexander Lowen's teacher was Wilhelm Reich. And Reich, as a healing professional, tried to liberate the breath with some very dramatic things, screaming and pounding on the chest and opening up. Alexander Lowen refined that, and then people began combining psychotherapy with yoga and other forms of breathing and meditation. So on the professional level, breath work has slowly, consistently found its way into the area of psychotherapy. But there was a whole other branch of breath work that took place outside of the professional field. And this is what I entered. In fact, I was one of the few people that practiced as a psychotherapist that was involved in the original rebirthing and breathwork movement. it was more attracted to by people who were spiritual seekers, people who wanted to break the bonds of stereotypical thinking and culture and to open themselves to other realms spiritually. So these people, without, quotes, professional training, experimented quite bravely and with their own bodies and their own lives. This took place in California and, well, in New York, across the United States. When I first heard of it, there was nothing in the Midwest at that point. So I had to travel to California, New Orleans, and put the family on a plane and go to various places to learn particularly about the faster than normal breathing, as I call it, which was evolving at this time. Now, as you certainly know and have expertise in, breath modulation with slower than normal breathing has been around since people started breathing. Yoga practices also have employed some faster than normal breathing. But it hasn't been popularized as it began to be in the 1970s and moved forward from that. So people from all various walks of life began to experiment with how they could open and free their minds and free their sense of aliveness through the, quotes, breathwork movement, which was parallel to it being used by professionals. But there was much less constriction on it, so there's a lot more experimentation. Breathing in hot tubs, breathing in saunas, breathing on the seashore, breathing outside, breathing in nature, all of which I participated in and at the same time then sought what I could judiciously introduce into working in the clinical field. It's been somewhat my life work and still is.
Mm-hmm. In Breakthrough with Breathwork, you note, again, the different tempos of the technique and some of the limitations that pranayama, the classic yogic breathing, which tends to be slow, and that at some point, at least with certain types of clients, that like trauma patients, that there may be some limitations to that type of breath work. Can you say something about the role that maybe deeper and faster breath work has in dealing with certain types of individuals?
Okay, yes. Well, in my evolution, I came to put all of the breathwork techniques that I found useful in spiritual growth as well as psychological and emotional healing under the rubric of therapeutic breathwork. And the slower than normal breathing, which I call maintenance breathing, I find very useful for everyone to some degree. Okay? It's mindfulness is one of the things that it's called nowadays, but it's also when it's actually measured down to 4 to 5 breaths a minute, called coherent breathing. Many people have done research on this and demonstrated that it lowers blood pressure. In fact, the FDA has even endorsed it. It's one of the few things that they've endorsed that's just a breathing technique, because breathing 4 to 5 breaths a minute for at least 3 to 4 minutes for a number of days in a row reduces blood pressure even in the long term. So that's a wonderful practice, and it's not something you do 24 hours a day, but it's something that you do in the morning or evening or during the day that helps to calm you, helps to bring you back to center, recognizing, oh, I'm here now talking to Tom, and not get too much in my head. The caution with that type of breath work in its clinical use is that if you're working with someone who's dealing with trauma, getting back into their body precipitously or forcibly by slowing the breath down for a long period of time can be overwhelming because it brings them into evocative feelings which can even be re-traumatizing. So some of the leading researchers now who are working with the field of trauma recovery aren't recommending meditative, vipassana, slower breathing as much as they are yoga. Yoga uses the breath and actually helps to focus, but it's focusing much more on the body and the body posture, which seems to be safer and easier for people with severe trauma in particular to use as they come more and more into safety in their body. Faster than normal breathing, on the other hand, when it is judiciously used, can break through certain holding patterns that do not happen with just slower than normal breathing or even regular everyday breathing, because our mind has learned how to hold and configure ourselves in postures that are temporarily safe. Unfortunately, these holding patterns become constrictions after a while. And when I'm ready to grow, if I am holding my chest tight and my jaw and my throat and my back and my pelvis and all of these areas of the body where there have been perhaps traumatizing experiences are being constricted, it's very hard then to open and to release. So with the proper training, we can introduce some faster than normal breathing in a context of safety, in a context in which a person can begin to associate those feelings of aliveness with safety, which before were associated with danger. So, neurologically speaking, the slower than normal breathing is working with the parasympathetic system, which is the calming, everyday autonomic process. The faster than normal breathing tends to initiate the sympathetic nervous system, which is emergency, fight, flight. And in states of emergency, our hypothalamus cuts off connections to the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in long-term planning and rationalization, and shuttles all of our energy into the amygdala, into the periaqueductal gray, those lower brainstem functions which have to do with keeping the organism alive, keeping the organism in survival mode. Now, there's an interesting thing that's noted about this, is that when we are in that survival mode, okay, I'm hyper aroused. I'm looking, okay, I heard a loud explosion. Do we run out the door, Tom? Do we hide underneath the desk? Is the ceiling, When I'm in a hyper aroused state, everything that's happening right now is my reality. I'm not thinking about what people in the next room are doing, or do I need a fresh cup of coffee or something like that. I am right here, right now, which translated into regular life, when people often get in a very hyper-aroused state, the fact that you drank out of my cup, that's a terrible thing, and I'm seeing the end of the world with smaller incidents. Now, we all know that just from life, that people in a highly aroused state are blowing things up, as it were, making things seem very real. Well, we're understanding that neurologically, that the heightened arousal can lead to things being very real. Now, if in a clinical setting, we can work with the sympathetic nervous system, activating it through judiciously using faster than normal breathing, which might be anywhere from 30 to 70 breaths a minute, that we can associate that with safety and their being in control, not going into a trance, not going into flashback, but staying in reality, staying right here. They regained control over situations that they thought were overwhelming and consequently had blanked out, literally made into implicit-only memory in their consciousness, which is inaccessible to them until something triggers it, and then all of a sudden we're off to the races. I'm back experiencing trauma, and I have no clue as to why that's happening or where I'm going with it. So faster than normal breathing with the training, with a person being able, as a therapist, to recognize and work with those states within themselves, are in a position to help others, whereas just the verbal approach itself, or even slower than normal breathing, might take a lot longer to get to those breakthroughs.
In yoga, there is an emphasis placed upon the role of the breath in movement. And with consciousness of the breath in movement, as well as the focusing of the mind, often on the breath as you move, with the intent of sometimes, depending upon how deeply one goes into this path, the use of the mind to move energy in the body. And I'm wondering, in the breathwork discipline, is there attention given just to the role of energy?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. The breath is the rainbow bridge of energy that connects us from the most dense of energies, our physical movement, to the most refined of energies, our spiritual movement. And so I like to think in the broader extended sense of breath being more than just the movement of air in the lungs and its transfer to the bloodstream and to the metabolism, that from the yoga tradition it's called prana. It's the energy that's actually within the air. And breath energy and its movement in the body is actually the focus of breath work, that we can move our energy more into zones of safety, connection, integration, and coherence, rather than being disintegrated, scattered, isolated, and fearful.
Does breath work as a discipline make certain assumptions about human nature? For example, that the normal condition of a human being is one of blockage, frozen energy that has to be addressed, regardless if we're talking about somebody with a clinical diagnosis or just a person on the street that is just dealing with life situations.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's two directions I'd like to come to your question from. One is my personal definition of breath work and a collective of people that are using breath work more as a holistic approach. And from that perspective, the pure, unadulterated breath is fresh aliveness, is wholeness. And it's only through fear, constriction, limited thinking that we begin to adopt holding patterns, which in the beginning are for the purpose of creating safety, but in their being prolonged become prisons for us, the holding patterns. So the natural state is one of health, is one of vitality, is one of wholeness that we're returning to, as opposed to we're malformed. But I'm speaking from one perspective in breath work. So the second thing is that we're looking to find an umbrella for the term breath work, which includes many disciplines, many different ways of coming to it, but have a central theme or a focus. So using breath in martial arts, for example, to train one to be a killer or an assassin. That's a different form of breath work than what we're talking about here. But it's not been in common parlance. So there's a movement actually going on as we speak to incorporate all the fields of breath work that are working towards healing, integration, and unity. And this movement is initiated by Rabia Hayek of Do As One, Jessica Dibb, Inspiration Community, Petri Berenson, Philosophical Breathwork, and myself. And we're proposing that the actual word in the dictionary be changed to, because there is no word in the dictionary for right now for breathwork, but that we have a word for breathwork. That definition is the experiential field of study and practice that employs various breathing techniques individually and in groups to cultivate self-awareness and the enhancement of physical, emotional, cognitive, or spiritual well-being. So you can see it's very broad and inclusive, but it's also pointed. We're looking for well-being. We're looking for working with restoring natural vitality in life.
So the purpose then is, if I'm hearing you correctly, is to aid individuals to break out of their cage, the constricted mind and body?
In the vernacular, that's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. Well, in that sense, then you could say maybe this is not very different than almost any spiritual path.
It has a common goal to all spiritual paths, which is freedom, liberation, sense of oneness. But every spiritual path uses certain techniques and certain ways to get there. Breathwork is one of those ways which focuses on the breath, but not exclusively. I never just come in with a person is coming to me for work in healing and psychotherapy or even in breath work. I never confine it to all we're working with is your breath. That, again, is dividing the person up into separate components. The breath has to be involved with movement, has to be involved with structure, has to be involved with expression, has to be involved with feeling, has to be involved with our spiritual aspirations.
Well, and so along those lines then, given your 40 years of history in dealing with a myriad of individuals, what are some of the most profound awakenings that you can remember that you have either experienced personally or have seen in others?
There are particular examples, of course, that stand out for all of us. Usually our own personal examples stand out. It's like when all of a sudden you experience the term awakening and everything looks very different. It's like everything is vibrant. Colors stand out. But more than that, there's a sense of connectedness with the world, a sense of unity and friendship, loving connection. There's a story which I don't know if is apocryphal or if it's true, but I like the story, so I keep repeating it. Albert Einstein, who many people think was an intelligent person and quite an explorer of different realities, and on his deathbed was asked, what would you like to leave the world with? Kind of as a parting gift. And people had their pencils all ready for another E = MC squared or something like that. And the story goes that he thought for a long time, and he said, I think the most profound thing facing humanity right now is the question, do we live in a friendly universe or not? Now, you think at first glance, oh, that's kind of what? Is Al going off? Is he? But the more I thought about it, the more I loved it. Because it's putting it right back in our laps. Who is defining this universe? If I approach the universe as a friendly place, as a place that is cooperative in my existence and is lending me exactly what I need to grow, and I am participating in that with others, then I'm living in a whole different world. It has been my privilege. I've often said this, Tom. I said, I've got the best job in the world because with almost every breathwork session where a person has that kind of breakthrough, they wake up with some experience of that. So when you ask me what is the most profound breath work, it's every one that a person gives themselves permission to wake up. I feel like I'm a midwife seeing a new life being reborn before my eyes. Mm-hmm. Talk about a contact high, as they did in the 60s. It's a wonderful experience.
So in your experience, can you think of situations that perhaps were mysterious awakenings, uncanny occurrences that seem to have been the result of breathwork, at least as one tool that was being used by a client?
Oh, there are many such things. I tend not to focus on the sensational because it sets up expectations for people. Like I tell a story about someone cured by this, that, or the other thing, then people say, oh, well, if I do breath work, then I'll... Well, there's a healing that can take place even if there is not a physical remission of a certain condition that a person has. So I believe breath work is integrally involved in healing, and at times that is very physical. For example, the woman who came in to see me who was going to have an operation that week, and she was going to have polyps removed from her uterus. These had been witnessed on whatever screening devices that they use, and she had an appointment for surgery, wanted to come in and use breath work to assist in the healing process. She had a wonderful session. We came back the next month, and I asked her how the operation went. And she said, well, the surgeon was angry at me. I was angry at you. How could that be? What happened? She said, well, when they went in to do the surgery, there were no polyps. We had focused on healing the polyps in that breathwork session, and there were none to be found. The surgeon was very upset. And understandably so, I guess. So, yes, physical things do happen that way. More importantly, in my estimation, are some of the emotional healings, though, that take place, which aren't, say, as dramatically measurable in physical terms. A woman, for example, who had been estranged from her mother, been years of no contact and very painful and hostile separation that had gone on. In the course of her breathwork session, she came to an openness of heart and a forgiveness of herself and her mother. Had the courage then to go back and to initiate contact with her mother, which she'd been very fearful of. She did it, went back, got permission to knock on the door, and her mother came to the door, opened her arms, welcomed her to her bosom, and said, I'm so sorry for all that's gone on between us. And this was astounding. The woman hadn't said a word. So that kind of spontaneous healing occurs continuously. I've often said that I have the best job in the world because anytime a person goes into breath work and releases their holding patterns, mental, emotional, physical, spiritual, their heart opens and it's like a newborn coming out. I feel like a midwife at times. I get a rush of energy myself just watching people come out and see the world with fresh eyes and an open heart.
What do those types of transformations, and maybe all types of transformations, say about the purpose of our lives as human beings?
So, I consider purpose as our highest form of pleasure underneath satisfactions for doing well or simple pleasures of the flesh, as it were. We need all of those, but purpose is, to me, the pinnacle of life meaning and fulfillment. And breath work is directed towards coming back to an authentic, a direct experience of who we are and consequently what we're doing here. So sometimes when it's associated with healing, people think that breathwork is about finding trauma, looking for the boogeyman. And I'm quick to let people know from the get-go in doing breathwork, we're not looking for bad things. What we're looking to do is to come back to the experience of joy of being alive, of being connected with Source, of being one with Source. If anything gets in the way of that, okay, we'll deal with it. If it's a physical thing, I'm going to get a Charlie horse, I'm breathing too much. Or if it's an emotional thing, boy, I'm angry. If it's a mental thing, I can't understand why God does this. And if it's a spiritual crisis, whatever it is, we're looking to breathe through it, to not to come to it with a pat answer, but the breakthrough is an experience of my truth. The breakthrough is an experience that no one else can take away from me. No one can say, you're not joyful. You're not really joyful. That's just the balance of nitrogen in your system. You're getting high from being flooded with, I experience it, and that's a life changer.
So you're really touching upon the deeper sense of purpose, of human purpose.
Yes.
That transcends all the different careers people choose that are of interest to them.
Exactly. A career can be fitting of my purpose or not. I could be cleaning bathrooms, but still have a great sense of purpose in what I'm doing. A career might change, but my purpose won't. Mm-hmm. I will still be here to be that unified connection with the divine.
You've painted a worldview that is much broader, expansive, and sacred than what most people feel that they occupy. Through techniques like breathwork, do you see that they are or can become gateways to that divinity that you're speaking of? The fact that for many spiritual traditions, the world is populated by unseen forces and unseen beings?
Well, from my perspective, I am no more divine than anyone else. We're all plain garden variety divine human beings. I can become more aware of that divinity, and I can enjoy it more, and I can share it more directly and consciously. So it's not a measure, you see, good, bad, right, wrong, it's all the mind. I am not my mind. I have a mind, you have a mind. Our minds are very useful tools, like computers, if you will. But the minds have been programmed. Who is the programmer? Who's the one that's setting up how the glasses I'm going to use to interpret my life with? If I come back to ownership of my being the director of my mind and my life, in concert and co-creating with Divine Spirit, then I'm not trapped in my programs. I'm not trapped in my computer. Everyone has that potential. Everyone and every being is part of that wholeness. The journey that we're talking about, the quest, is one of awakening to the truth of that, the experience of it, and the sharing of it.
Jim, thank you so much for spending time with me.
Tom, it is my pleasure. I always love being with a fellow journeyer en route. And I invite all who are listening to join us in this route. Blessings.